Ohene has just whispered to me that I have only 3 minutes. It's really unfortunate. First of all, I should preface my remarks by confessing that I was invited to comment on Dr. Slater's excellent presentation only on the first part, that is the review of governance. I think there was an assumption that perhaps somebody else will deal with the second part. So my remarks are mainly focusing on the first part of the governance. And I should start by indicating that it's really sad that he got only 5 to 7 minutes to make this presentation, because the document is really 200 pages. Yeah, the original document is 200 pages, and when he tried to summarize it, he could only do it in 25 pages, as it was. So it's really serious, very rich, very comprehensive overview. I could use the word, he dissected the issue of both governance and service delivery. However, I'm also aware of the challenges that he and his team faced in preparing this paper, and even in suggesting that we use it as a basis for discussion. The issue that he's addressing, particularly with reference to governance, even in the context of Africa, is 50 years old. The issue of intergovernmental relationship between institutions, issues of decentralization, even in the African settings, are 50 years old. My own country, I happen to be a Tanzanian, we promulgated decentralization in 1972. And the university that I used to work with, Dar es Salaam University, 3 years later, there was a school called the Dar es Salaam School in that place. And the Dar es Salaam School was a critical Marxist school. And 3 years after promulgating decentralization in Tanzania, that is around 75, scathing critiques came around on the nature of institutional relationships that are emerging in Tanzania. Rather significantly, the observations they made and the recommendations they also made are almost similar to the sort of recommendations we are hearing today. In 2002, I used to work with UN Habitat. UN Habitat commissioned a study. It was a study of looking at around 20 countries in the world on the experience of intergovernmental relationships, particularly on decentralization. This was a global study. It included France, UK, India, Norway, Thailand, a number of Asian countries, and a number of African countries. Curiously again, the conclusions that came up are similar to what we are observing today. In fact, there was a critical review of the nature of decentralization in France. I mean, if you didn't see the title of the French report, you would think they were discussing Tanzania at that time. Now, this was 1975, 2000, 40 years later. Today, we are hearing the same observations being made in Africa. Very depressing, in fact. Crisis of institutions, incapacity to function, dysfunctional processes and systems, a whole set of diagnoses. The irony, the paradox of it, this morning, the ministers were very optimistic about this continent. They were saying, we're on the rise, we're doing things. But scholars are suggesting that Africa is in a crisis. The institutions are not functioning. I'm asking myself, hasn't this continent changed for 50 years? Hasn't there been any change since 1972 in Tanzania until 2016? Are those processes and reforms all dysfunctional? I'm compelled to suggest that I think we need a very critical review of the scholarly paradigms, scholarly theoretical bases, and empirical, and the tools that we use to look at the empirical reality. Yes, there may be a crisis in the reality. There may be distortion in the reality. But I think we are compelled at the level of scholarship to look at the tools that we use. the methodologies that we use, the paradigms that are informing us in looking at contexts such as the African context. In fact, I'm compelled to suggest that there is a very statist review of this continent. The tools that we are using are not rigorous enough to capture the dynamic of change that is taking place in this continent. In fact, the very theory of it, especially the institutional theory, since the 1960s and 70s, has traveled so much. Many of you, of my generation at least, you went to schools of public administration. At that time, the critical institution was administration. The paradigm of development was led by administration. If you put systems in place, things will work. By the 80s comes the Berg report, and they say, no, I think we need to borrow from the business sphere and look at issues of management. There was a paradigm shift from public administration to business management. Everybody was writing about development management in Africa in the 80s. But it was realized by the 90s that even that one was very state-centric, very technocratic, does not consider a lot of other variables. There was the notion of governance. Yes, I'll stop. So I'm only saying that the notion of governance that this title is calling for a different methodology. It has to capture the dynamic of change in this continent. And I think if you look at it in static terms, you will find a very dismal picture. It is an analysis of dystopia in this continent. Everything is bleak, everything is desolate. But one has to be surgical in terms of looking at the African situation to capture the change momentum that is taking place. In that regard, we know that even in Lagos, they have now a blue rail. There are transportation institutions that are working in African cities. There are BRTs. There are water utility companies that are functioning in this continent. There are modalities of garbage collection in this continent. There are positive business models. The city of Dakar had been able to develop a bond from the private sector. Why aren't we talking about those positive institutions and positive experiences in this continent? My conclusion, Mr. Moderator, is that I think we need a paradigm shift. Scholars have to capture the real dynamic of Africa. If we remain in static mode, we will always see the dismal picture. And in that regard, we need to disaggregate even the data that we use on an annual basis, on a spatial basis. Otherwise, if we blanket the whole system, we lose sight of the reality that is taking place. Thank you.